Will RFK Jr. un-Fauci our food or make matters worse? That's what we're talking about in this special edition of the Business of Agriculture.
Hey, Damian Mason here with a question before we hop into this episode of the Business of Agriculture. If you farm for a living, you employ a lot of amazing technology, from your inputs that you put into the soil to the tractor that you sit in, your combine, and the amazing data that it harvests. But has your soil analytics kept up technologically with everything else in your farming operation? I would venture to say that no, it is not. Sure, you check for your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, your micronutrients as well. But what about disease pressure? Do you know what diseases and what pests you're going to face next year? No, you don't. But you can now figure that out with pattern.ag's predictive analytics. Think about it. They can tell you now with testing what the likelihood of facing nasty diseases, things like cyst nematode or sudden death syndrome, what the likelihood of you having this in your field, then you know how to prepare, how to treat, and where to invest your money. It's using technology to make you bigger yields and therefore make you bigger money. Go to www.pattern.ag to learn more. They are pioneering the way in predictive agronomy.
Hey there, welcome to my kitchen, and we're talking about RFK Jr. and whether or not he will un-Fauci our food or make matters worse. If you're listening to this on all the dozens of audio platforms where you get your podcasts, thank you for joining. If you're watching, you can see this is not my normal set. I'm coming at you from my Arizona kitchen, and I've got a whole bunch of food in front of me. I'm talking about, in this special edition, something that we're going to have to keep our eye on over the next month, for certainly the next year. RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., an activist attorney from the Kennedy dynasty, has a track record that troubles some in agriculture, including me. But there are some bright spots, and that's what I want to cover in this episode. Okay, first off, RFK Jr. is going to very likely be the head of the Health and Human Services. There will be some resistance, but I think that he is the kind of person that when Trump and him said, this is going to be my role, I don't think it's going to not happen. I would be very surprised if it doesn't happen. Health and Human Services oversees the Food and Drug Administration. It is separate from the United States Department of Agriculture. However, will have a very big, outsized role in the future and his campaign, Make America Healthy Again. Okay, I've got all kinds of food in front of me. We're going to get into that. But your first question is, Damian, you're saying un-Fauci our food. What the hell are you talking about? You don't mean to say that Fauci has something to do with our food, do you? No. And if you're saying, wait a minute, Fauci? You mean that little prick that made us wear masks, that told us all to stand 6 feet apart and walk certain ways up and down an aisle in a store, and that would prevent the disease, even though it was all completely unscientific? That's exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Fauci, and no, he does not have a direct influence on our food. But when I say Fauci or Fauci'd, I'm talking about this concept where a bureaucrat with maybe a MD like Fauci, a bureaucrat, a lifelong career politician, uses bastardized or even fraudulent science to achieve political gain, power, or profit. And in Fauci's case, all three of those things have happened. And when I think about what has happened to our food, a similar thing has happened. So no, Fauci is not directly involved in our food, although the little pecker's been around Washington, D.C. since like 1980, one of the highest paid federal employee, and has tentacles everywhere. He is a corrupt bureaucrat, fraud, and frankly, I think that bad things should come to him. But that's a story for a different episode. Let's talk about what I mean when I say Fauci'd. Long before there was Tony Fauci, who was on TV every day, long before him, there was a guy named Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys was a professor, most prominently at University of Minnesota in the 1950s. His study was nutrition, so he's a PhD with a focus in nutrition. He's the guy that came up with the study of 7 countries. Maybe you've heard about this Mediterranean diet. That was all Ancel Keys, a PhD who had this idea that if you ate saturated fat, meaning fat from sources like these porterhouse steaks that I just got out of my freezer, fresh from the farm, okay, fresh frozen from the farm, that you were going to die. Ancel Keys in the 1950s was the Fauci of his time. He wanted fame, he wanted political leverage, and he wanted to make money off of him being a self-proclaimed, genius. Kind of like Fauci. Remember when Fauci said on TV, if you criticize him, you're criticizing science, because as Tony Fauci said, because I am science. Imagine the audacity, imagine the arrogance. Well, Ancel Keys was Fauci of his time with the same level of arrogance and audacity. Ancel Keys went to 7 countries that he hand-selected where the incidence of heart disease and heart attacks were very low. And he handpicked those countries also because they fit what his narrative was. That if you ate a certain diet, meaning a lower-fat Mediterranean-style diet, less meat, less cheese, you would therefore not have as much incidence of heart attack. The entire low-fat movement that you might have been raised with, if you're my age, low-fat was everywhere in the stores in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. The whole movement against saturated fat began with Ancel Keys. It helped that Dwight Eisenhower, was the president and had started having heart attacks. Dwight Eisenhower was looking for a reason. Why am I having these heart attacks? The Kansas native said, must be because you grew up eating meat and you eat bacon. The fact that he was in his 60s, the President of the United States, was a stressful job, had been the general in charge of the Allied forces in the European theater during World War II, kind of a stressful job, and the fact that he smoked 2 or 3 packs a day of cigarettes, kind of bad for your heart, had nothing to do with it. He decided it was because of eating meat growing up and because of saturated fat. So he and Ancel Keys had this wonderful little relationship. It fit what Dwight Eisenhower wanted to hear. Not going to give up the stress, not going to give up the cigarettes. Oh, it must be the bacon. And so therefore, this thing got perpetuated. Now I'm talking about why the Fauci thing happens. If you're a doctor or a politician or a bureaucrat or a professor and you want to gain fame, no quicker way to do that than to tie into the political movement in Washington, D.C., capture a lot of media, and perpetuate your beliefs, your narrative. And by the way, what if it's also good for your political position? You gain some power, you sell some books, and you make some money. Yes, Ancel Keys did that. Other companies then, food companies, hopped in on this entire Fauciing of our food, which happened back starting in the 60s. That's where the low-fat thing came about. It is proven. Nina Teicholz, who is in a recent episode of The Business of Agriculture, author of the book, The Big Fat Surprise, how butter and fat and meat, basically the point of her book is we were all bamboozled. Saturated fat, meaning fat from places like lard or from meat or from butterfat, milk, whole milk, butter, is not the culprit. You don't get fat by eating saturated fat. More importantly, if you have some cholesterol from sources like eggs, it doesn't create high cholesterol. That's all, even though it sounds like it makes sense, it was all bad science, fraudulent science, because the makers of companies that make things like Crisco and margarine hopped on with Ancel Keys' findings, or fraudulent or bastardized science, if you will, and said, this is going to be great for us to sell products. So those food companies, eager to sell products, became lobbyists and started pushing their low-fat agenda. By the way, I cover that in my own book, Food Fear. If you haven't picked it up, I encourage you to do so, but I'm not here to sell books. I'm here to talk about this whole thing with our food and how RFK Jr. might end up negatively or positively impacting it. Big point to be made here. Companies do what is best for their business, just like you do. Your bottom line, you're looking at how you can make money, so do these food companies. So imagine all this low-fat push, Mediterranean diet, saturated fat is bad for you. It starts becoming a thing in the 60s, and it really takes hold in the late 50s, early 60s, and it stays taking hold. The makers of Crisco got behind this and started pushing what was bastardized science and said that's why you should use Crisco instead of butter, Crisco instead of lard. I don't have any Crisco here to hold up. That's why I'm holding up this stick of Land O'Lakes butter, because here at the Mason household, we're all about the real thing, butter. So how can how can RFK Jr. change our food? He does question what has been establishment science. And by establishment, I mean DC bureaucracy establishment science. He has gone on the record and said, all of your stuff is bunk. The dietary guidelines put forward by the United States government are bad, and it's bad for our health. RFK Jr. has a point. In his Make America Healthy Again campaign, he says, we're not healthy. We'll try and deny that. He says that maybe it's the food. You could probably argue that, yeah, he's got a good point there. I want to get into where there's going to be winners and losers. Before I do that, I want to tell you about my friends at Redox. Redox Bionutrients is a company that's my sponsor. Fantastic company, family owned, began 30 years ago, and specialty crop worked their way into turf and now are doing more and more broad acre. If you are a row crop farmer, you really ought to consider how you can use Redox Bionutrients to help you balance your soil and get more output with less traditional input. You're spending a whole bunch of money on the same things you've been using that your dad used and your grandfather used. Maybe it's time to change up your inputs, use less of them, and use things like bionutrients to get more bang for your fertility buck. Go to redoxgrows.com to check that out and see what you can do. I want to get back to this thing about the bad food science. We began the dietary guidelines for Americans in 1980. Ronald Reagan was the president when the dietary guidelines came out. Now, as I cover in my book, we had people telling Americans what they should eat long ago. During World War II, they told Americans to eat less of certain things to free up resources for the war effort. But it really hit a fever pitch starting in the early 80s with the first edition of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Now, when I was a little kid, we had the 4 food groups. You remember that? There was your meat, your grain, your fruits, your vegetables, all this kind of thing. So it got a big fever pitch going by the 1980s when the Dietary Guidelines for Americans were released. The president appoints a committee to put this whole recommendation together. Every 5 years it comes out. It has had iteration after iteration. And the one thing that I can tell you, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans are completely flawed. They stick with their same old thing of low fat, skim milk, all the same recommendations that have not worked or accomplished anything. In fact, if you want to talk about the success of the Dietary Guidelines, let me just show you this graph. And if you're listening, just imagine. I'm showing you a graph right now that in 1980, when the Dietary Guidelines for Americans first came out, we were at 12.7% obesity. Today, in 2024, we're at 42% obesity. Yeah, we 3.5 times our obesity rate in 44 years. Once the government, the bloated fat government, started telling us what to eat, we became bloated and fat. In one of the iterations of the Dietary Guidelines, to talk about bastardized science, it becomes appointees that want to push their agenda. And imagine if you are a professor, like Ansel Keys was. You're a professor at Tufts University, which sometimes that's who is on the guidelines. You've never been on a farm, you've never produced food, you know nothing about agriculture, but you live in affluent part of Massachusetts, let's say, and you lean very hard left. And you decide when you go to the farmer's market that everybody should eat organic. And in fact, they are so out of touch because they make a lot of money. They think that every poor American should eat the way they eat. Vegetarian, organic, whatever. So that becomes very biased in their recommendations for the dietary guidelines, and such things have happened. In fact, under Obama, one of the appointees in the committee for the dietary guidelines stated that Americans should eat less red meat. Less meat, period. Had nothing to do with health, but it was because of global warming, because of climate change. So does this sound like it's dietary recommendation or political pushing? Exactly. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans are a very bastardized, fraudulent, or pushed and paid for by big food. I mean, come on, think about it. If you're a professor and you lean a certain way, then all of a sudden a company says, wait a minute, I can hop in with that. So that's what's happened. We've gotten to where the dietary guidelines are completely skewed by political beliefs. You're saying, Damian, what difference does that make? They come out every 5 years. I don't eat what the dietary guidelines tell me to. Maybe you don't, but it does have an impact because first off, the dietary guidelines tend to demonize certain foods and also create big saviors or create big fan bases of other foods. One of the dietary guidelines that came out one of the years stated that Americans should not eat meat. That's usually what they say. No fat, no meat, because that's bad for you, which is not even true scientifically. And then they said you should have 11 servings of grain. 11 servings of grain and bread. Apparently they didn't get the memo that man cannot live on bread alone. 11 servings from the grain and bread category, folks. I have raised livestock with less rations of grain in their diet. Humans, by the way, are omnivorous, and we also were hunters and gatherers before we cultivated agriculture. You know what? We're not made to digest and eat 11 servings from the grain category. We're supposed to eat meat, vegetables, fruits, berries. Yeah. This is where we've got some issues. So the dietary guidelines actually do have a bigger impact than you think. Because from the dietary guidelines, all school lunches are derived. And the school lunches becomes this very big political volleyball. And this is where I think RFK Jr. might actually be able to help. Also, the recommendations for those on SNAP, welfare, and food stamps. Okay, now you're starting to understand what I'm talking about. So RFK Jr. says, Americans eat too many potato chips. They eat too much processed food. I'm holding up Wheat Thins right now. I just held up potato chips. I can go on and on and on. So that's one of the things that are in his crosshairs, processed food. In fact, he says that SNAP recipients, that's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, used to be called food stamps, $100 billion a year. I want you to just put that number in your head. $100 billion, and that's using current dollars, $100 billion of your tax dollars and mine go for the SNAP program, formerly food stamps. SNAP feeds 12.6% of our population. About 42, 43 million Americans eat off of the food stamp SNAP program. Okay, now you understand why this matters? Because dietary guidelines for Americans are supposed to be helping the poorest among us. 1 in 8 of us, one out of every 8 Americans is on this program. Incidentally, that does not count WIC, which is Women, Infant, Children. It does not count at least 2 other nutrition programs. And also that $100 billion does not count the lunch program. U.S. Department of Agriculture is has to adopt the school lunch program based on what the dietary guidelines for Americans tell it to do. Now you understand why this matters. How big is that? 30 million school lunches are served every day, of which 20 million are free or reduced, meaning you and I pay for them. 14 million breakfasts are served in our schools, of which 11 million are free. Okay, so 30 million students fed every day, 20 million free, 14 million are given breakfast, 11 million of those are free. What we've done in agriculture, to our own detriment, is then go and lobby to get in the school lunch program and make it so that we can sell more product and have lots of volume. The thing is, we've kind of gotten to where we're our own worst enemy because we put things in there like red delicious apples, which suck because they're not delicious, skim milk. Remember Michelle Obama? I'm holding whole milk in my hand right now. Michelle Obama, before RFK, decided she was going to change the school lunch program in 2010. Not a doctor, not a nutritionist, not a dietitian. In fact, Michelle Obama's entire credentials are she was a diversity director for University of Chicago. Black woman, got hired for a role that fit her. That was her credential. No nutrition, no science, no MD, no background at all in dietetics. But she single-handedly, not even elected in office, by the way, was not the director of Health and Human Services, was not in a post at USDA. She was married to the guy that was elected president. She single-handedly changed the school lunch program. One of the things that she decided was that kids are fat, and it's because of whole milk. So they took the whole milk out and gave them only skim milk. As a dairy farm kid, let me just tell you, skim milk tastes like water that's colored white. I drink 4.4% milk butterfat milk. Incidentally, this jug right here is 3.25%. That's whole from the grocery store. I drank 4.4% out of the bulk tank, unpasteurized, unhomogenized, every day with 2 tablespoons of Nestle Quick Put in it as a kid. Do I look fat, Michelle Obama? No. Joke I always make, maybe these little fat-ass kids should bale hay for a couple of summers and work that fat off them. Here's the reality. We didn't resist that in agriculture because the dairy processors said, hey, wait a minute. If we only can sell skim milk, that means we can rake all that butterfat off of those gallons, and then we still sell the same amount of cartons of pints or half pints of milk to the schools. We'll rake off the fat, and we'll value add that and put that into the butter and into the cottage cheese and into the cheese and into the ice cream. So it's a win-win for us. It's a win-win for the short-term dairy processors because you'll still sell the same gallonage of shitty skim milk to the school kids by law because that's what Michelle Obama made. But you know what you're going to do? You're going to create a generation and another generation and another generation that hates your product because it tastes like shit, because there's no flavor in skim milk. Why are they switching over to oat milk and almond milk? Oh, I wonder. Well, because for the last 14 years, you've been giving school kids skim milk that tastes like water, so they went to something that actually has flavor. Instead of whole chocolate milk, they're switching over to your competitor, cashew milk, almond milk, and all the other categories, oat milk that has artificial flavoring in it. Now you understand. I did get off on a little diatribe there, but I'm telling you, the school lunch program, we've screwed that up a lot of ways in agriculture. Let me get back to whether RFK Jr. can un-Fauci our food. So our food's been affected by fraudulent science, bad science, bastardized science in the attempt to sell more product or control outcomes. So you got the person like the Ansel Keys or somebody that's on the committee for the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Those aren't the only people profiting off of bad food advice. I'll get to this in a minute. Let me now take a break and tell you about Truterra. Truterra has been my sponsor for entirety here of 2024. They're not going to join me again in 2025, but I want to make sure I thank them, and I want to make sure you understand what they can do for you. If you're a farmer or if you're a landowner, you need to look at diversified revenue streams. It's going to be tight in agriculture. Commodity prices are down. So what can you do? Diversify your revenue stream with a sustainability program. Sustainability programs, I believe, are going to be the new thing. They're going to probably be required by USDA to get crop insurance down the road. It's going to be about nutrient management plans, sustainability plans, cover crops, reduce tillage, reduction of nitrogen inputs. This is where the things are going. Why not get ahead of the curve and get paid to do so? Truterra can help. Go to truterraag.com, T-R-U-T-E-R-R-A, truterraag.com. They're a part of Land O'Lakes, a stable company that at one point was in charge of this butter that I'm holding right here. Okay, let's talk about the others that profit off of bad food advice. An article came out in the Wall Street Journal about 2 weeks ago, and it was titled, "We battled big food. Can RFK Jr. succeed where we failed?" Okay, I read this article twice, so I'm going to save you the hassle from reading it. It was penned by a guy named Thomas Farley and Tom Frieden, both MDs. Oh, wait a minute. I can trust them because they're doctors. No, they're bureaucrats, just like Fauci. So again, you want to talk about how your food has been Fauci'd? Thomas Farley and Tom Frieden are both former commissioners of New York City Department of Health. Tom Frieden went on to then be the director of the Centers for Disease Control. Do you remember the Centers for Disease Control? Oh, and now he's involved in your food? Oh, wait a minute. Now you're talking about the Fauci Factor again. Yes, I am. Two bureaucrats, two politicians, two people who lean a certain way politically that want to tell you what to eat are also, they're no doctors. They don't take patients. They don't go and see anybody. They have an MD and they're bureaucrats. And guess what? They both were under Bloomberg in New York City. When Bloomberg, you might remember this, Michael Bloomberg floated out the idea, people are fat. You know why? It's because of the pop. I'm holding a Coca-Cola in my hand right now if you're not watching and you're listening. And guess what he said? We need a tax on soda. In fact, we need a ban on sodas over a certain size. Do you remember that? That was all people like Tom Frieden and Thomas Farley, the authors of this article right here, who are talking about how we need to battle big food. The way they went about battling big food was to propose a ban on soda pop in New York City over a certain size. If it's more than 16 ounces or 24 ounces, you can't have it. And then they're going to put huge taxes on soda pop. So this is something that I actually do see coming under RFK Jr., at least if he takes the advice of bureaucrats like Farley and Frieden. Now, to his credit, he's battled bureaucrats like them before. RFK Jr. battled Fauci on vaccines. RFK Jr. does have a pretty good track record of going against some of the bureaucracy. Maybe that's a good thing for food. It stands to, we shall see. I should just put it that way. So what we're talking about then is, how will this whole thing go? Will RFK Jr. say, you know what? I'm against processed foods. I think that the welfare class eat too many processed foods. He himself says in an interview that I just watched that 75% of SNAP goes for processed foods. That means it's $75 billion of spend if he's talking about percentage-wise of the spend, and he would like people to spend more money on things like vegetables. I'm holding up a lettuce right now. Here's the concern that I would have with that. Bureaucrats like Farley and Frieden that wrote this book believe that the welfare recipients, those that are on food stamps, WIC, aid to dependent children, various other nutrition programs where they get free money to buy food, they believe, and they recommend in this article, that RFK Jr. should go after the food companies. He wants them to go after them and put taxes on them, like, for instance, against Coke and Pepsi. Taxes on sodas, which they call for, and they say it's been done in 20 or 30 cities, like Seattle, and it's dropped consumption of soda pop. That's true. I'll still have my 2 Cokes per day. Somebody that's poor that drinks 10 Cokes a day might back off. Okay. Does it make them healthier? Maybe, marginally. But here's where you also do. You punish the poor. So when you start pushing for taxes, if the authors of this article have their way, they would tax anything that they deem to be unhealthy. Now you start talking about people like Bill Gates or Tony Fauci or Farley and Frieden. They're in charge of what you eat because they deem something to be healthy. And we say, oh, but it's based on the science. Well, is it really? Were mask mandates based on the science? Was standing 6 feet apart from one another based on the science? Only 25% capacity at a restaurant? Was that really based on the science? You can eat at a restaurant, but only if it's outside in an igloo that's heated? Come on. A lot of times we hear it's the science when it's really the money. You and I both know that, and the power and the control over food outcomes. So the food companies, of course, are going to navigate this as best they can. If there's a tax placed on soda, they're going to fight. If there's a limit based on a quantity, they're probably going to fight. But here's the other thing. Putting taxes on processed foods like this bag of chips right here is going to make them more expensive. And the elite class, the RFK Juniors, or the people that went to prestigious universities like the authors of this article, Drs. Frieden and Farley, who served as commissioner of New York City Department of Health, they live in what we might call ivory towers. They've never actually gone to a Dollar General store. They've never lived in Montpelier, Indiana, or rural Warren, Indiana, like I have. They don't understand these customers. So they believe, wrongly, because they're elitists, that if we just make bad food more expensive, we'll make these people make better choices. Let me point out something to you. Dollar General already has canned vegetables. You can have all the canned vegetables you want. Oh, they don't have fresh fruit. Okay, they have some fresh fruit, but here's the reality. The obese welfare recipient that lives in rural America that's on food stamps will walk right by a head of lettuce to pick up a bag of chips. I'm sorry, there are already lima beans at Dollar General, and those consumers that you believe are unhealthy because of marketing from the food companies, it might just be because their choice is to eat potato chips and processed food. It's not about lack of availability. This is a big myth. I get tired of hearing about food deserts from the elite groups that say that, oh, if we just had more fruits and vegetables. The authors of this article go so far as to say instead of subsidizing corn and soybeans, we should subsidize the production of more fruits and vegetables. Again, non-agricultural people, commissioners of New York City Department of Health, or former directors of the Centers for Disease Control. Let me give you a little hint from the world of agriculture. We actually already have shitloads of fruits and vegetables. In fact, the most wasted food category is in produce. About half of the produce at a grocery store that's on display will end up in the trash or go maybe to animal feed or some sort of composting. Most food that we waste is already fruits and vegetables. We don't need to subsidize more production of it. We're already producing more than we can. Plus, we flood, we bring in from other countries the stuff we can't grow. Speaking of stuff we can't grow, the authors of this article encouraged RFK Jr. to subsidize fruit and vegetable production and de-incentivize production of things like corn and soy. Why? Because RFK Jr. has seed oils absolutely in his crosshairs. Now, this is going to be a biggie for our industry. He believes that we're unhealthy because of seed oils. He's on the record of saying seed oils, and when he says seed oils, he means soybean oil, corn oil, canola oil, sunflower oil. Those are your 4 big ones here in the United States of America. Peanut oil to a lesser degree because it's just not as commonly used. But really, it's soy and corn that make up the bulk of it. If you were in Canada, it'd probably be canola oil because the western provinces are huge canola producers. So he's got a problem, RFK Jr., with seed oils, as he calls them. So I'm holding this vegetable in my hand right here. We use it for baking. We use it for a lot of stuff. Use it to cook, right? That's what we use this for. He says on the record that Americans were healthier when McDonald's fried their French fries in beef tallow rather than making the switch to vegetable oil. They might have a little bit of a point. In the 1950s and 60s and 70s, Americans were more healthy than they are right now. Even though we smoked, we weren't as overweight. We didn't have 12% of the nation as type 2 diabetes. That's the things we're dealing with now. He blames inflammation, body-wide inflammation, on seed oil. So I think this is going to be in our crosshairs. I'm not sure where it ends up. Obviously, corn and soy have a pretty big voice in Washington, D.C. There's another component that goes away from the lobbying and away from the politics. How, as much as we use vegetable oil in our baked goods, in our processed foods. Yes, I know that they're on the chopping block according to RFK Jr. How would you replace that volume with beef tallow? We couldn't cow up quickly enough. Lard, we've bred the fat out of pigs, unfortunately. So I don't know where we're going to replace this shortening with, this need for fat, for oils, for our cooking and our processing of food if we don't have some of this. So I'm going to be curious to watch that. One thing I want to point out, of course, is the non-ag crowd that's giving RFK recommendations, at least through articles in the Wall Street Journal. They say what you really need to do is subsidize fruit and vegetable production. I already covered that. We're up to our elbows in fruit and vegetables, and not only from the United States, places like Florida, Texas, here in Arizona, where I live in the winter, California. By God, we're good at making fruits and vegetables. Yay, 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 us. I'm all for it. But subsidizing more production of it isn't going to increase consumption. Oh yeah, well, because it'll make it cheaper. One of the calls that has been coming about from places like Bernie Sanders or the authors of this article, they want RFK Jr. in his role to give incentives to eat things like this vegetable that I'm holding here, my lettuce. So again, are we going to make it so that if you have food stamps and you get $300 a week, your $300 is worth $600, you get double the amount if you spend it in the produce aisle? Maybe. Again, the folks over at Frito-Lay, the folks over at Kraft Heinz, Mondelez, and all the food, you can go on down the line of all the food companies that are going to have a real problem with this and say, wait a minute, you're incentivizing to the point where you're not only giving the food away, you're doubling the benefit to buy fruits and vegetables. Well, we have a product that also humans want. And I think it really struggles to get past the fact that consumers want what they want. Pretending that a obese welfare recipient is going to change their dietary habits because of a politician is a little bit challenging, or because they just don't know, or availability. Again, I've been to Dollar General. I know that most of these elites have never been. There are vegetables at Dollar General. I've been there. Much of it's in a can, more frozen. That still works. But guess what? When it's next to the toast, next to the frozen pizza, the consumer oftentimes buys the frozen pizza and walks right by the bag of frozen green beans or frozen peas. Okay, let me get through a couple other things I want to point out here where I'm going to kind of close things out. The bastardized Fauciism of food, because fraudulent science, bad science, bastardized science, or more importantly, manipulated science was utilized by a lot of companies to sell products. If you're old enough to remember the 1990s, there was a product, 1980s and 90s, called egg beaters. I believe it's still on the shelf. Why? Because we were told back in the 70s and 80s, starting in the 80s, that eggs were bad for you. I'm holding up a dozen eggs right here. Eggs are not bad for you. Eggs are a great source of protein, great source of all sorts of vitamins, and it's an amazingly, usually affordable. I know egg prices are up a little bit right now. It's affordable. It's easily prepared. Children eat eggs. Eggs are a great food. We were told they're bad for you because of cholesterol, the war against cholesterol in the 80s. And what did we see? A bunch of food companies hopped on and said, wait a minute. We'll go ahead and capitalize on this. We can sell more egg beaters if we can just get rid of real eggs or convince the consumer to be afraid of eggs. Egg consumption dropped down to about 190 eggs per American per year in the early 90s. Here we are 30 years later. The truth is out. Eggs are not killing you. The cholesterol in eggs is not making you have high cholesterol. And we're up to about 290. We've gained 100 eggs of consumption per American per year because the truth comes out. This goes on and on and on. Again, we talk about Michelle Obama and her war against real milk. There's no scientific evidence that drinking whole milk causes you to be fat. In fact, dietary fat, butterfat, actually satiates you and fills you up. Empty carbohydrates in a bag of Doritos are far more likely to make you obese than whole milk ever would. So we might have a champion in RFK Jr., believe it or not. He's not against things like steak that I'm holding here in my hands. He's not against dietary fat from saturated sources, such as animal products, meaning meat and milk products. He is going to obviously incentivize certain things. We're curious as to whether or not he'll have much of a hand in the allocation of money. That's the big one. There's a lot of money that's tossed around. $100 billion for the SNAP program. The school lunch program is not even part of that. Let me tell you about the school lunch program. It comes from a different feed. And again, we're feeding 30 million kids a day. 20 million of them are for free. That's a big source of money. women and infant children, and several other nutrition programs. The RFK Jr. role may not be in charge of the purse strings. So he's going to be an activist, he's going to be an advocate, he's got his opinions, but he doesn't have the money. Somebody else has to approve that. So that remains to be seen. My other wrap on this that I want to cover is I believe that he actually does have his heart in the right place, that he wants to see America be healthier again. We have now a situation that is chronic. We got chronic disease. We've got type 2 diabetes that is 11 times what it was in the 1950s. Okay? What else? We've got obesity rates that are 3.5 times what they were 44 years ago. We've got the bulk, have you seen this study? The bulk of kids that are 20 years old right now couldn't pass the physical exam to join, to be in military service. And by the way, they made that physical test even easier. You don't have to do 20 pull-ups or 20 push-ups and 10 pull-ups anymore. They made it even easier to be in the armed services, and we still have the bulk of our population at age 20 is physically unfit enough they couldn't even pass the physical to be in military service. Are we unhealthy? Yes. Do we need to make America healthy again? Yes. Will RFK Jr. un-Fauci our food? It remains to be seen. I believe that processed foods are going to have a hard time. I know that they'll deploy their lobbyists, but we're going to be up against a real activist here. Remember, he went up against Monsanto and won. Monsanto became Bayer, and it was because of his activism that won. Cereal, seed oils, I think are going to be a little bit under more and more scrutiny. As far as taxes, as many people, as like the authors of this article propose, putting big taxes on food that is unhealthy, I do not see that being a win because that punishes the poorest among us. I'll still buy my Coke, I'll still buy a bag of chips, but what about the person that makes 1/4 as much money as I do? You're punishing them. So I don't see that being in a populist political environment where Donald Trump is, who won middle America. I don't see taxes being the method to push this through because there is going to be a real resistance to, I don't want to punish those blue collar people that voted for me. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of all of this. I'm still asking the question. I know maybe I didn't completely answer it. Will RFK un-Fauci our food? I believe to a certain degree he will. He'll call out the bastardized science that's gotten us to where we are. However, he's guilty himself of having some beliefs in bad science. Stay tuned. That's the question. I asked the question. I'm still putting it out there. I don't know. I can tell you where there's going to be struggles, as I already did. Until next time, I really thank you for being here. Share this episode with somebody that can benefit from it. From my kitchen right here, special edition of the Business of Agriculture. 380 episodes almost now in the can. Releases every Monday. Go back and listen to that episode that I did with Nina Teichels only a few weeks back. And that's the one where we talked about fat and the dietary guidelines and some other changes that are going to be coming down the pike. Until next time, thanks for being here. I really appreciate you. Welcome to my kitchen. Also, I've got a new show coming out called The Granary with my friends from Extreme Ag. You can go to extremeag.farm and find that, or just go on any of my social media feeds because I'll be sharing it there also. It's straight talk with my farm friends, sitting around my table, having a beer, talking about great things in agriculture. Check it out also. Till next time, thanks for being here. Coming at you from my kitchen, Damian Mason, and this is the Business of Agriculture. Hey, thanks for being here. This episode of the Business of Agriculture was brought to you by Pattern.ag. You've heard me talk about Pattern.ag because I think it's a pretty cool concept. New technology that allows you to predict the problems you're going to have and therefore treat them before those problems cost you money. What kind of problems am I talking about? Pests and disease. Things like cordon rootworm, sudden death syndrome, cyst nematode, and a whole bunch of other bad things that happen out there in the field that can cost you money. Guess what? Pattern Ag will let you find out ahead of time if the disease or the pest pressure is there, and therefore you're treating it before it costs you any money. What a great concept. Go to pattern.ag, that's www.pattern.ag, to learn more about their product, their technology, how it can make you money, save you yield, and also where you can find a rep that can come out there and do the work for you. Pattern.ag.